Dear friends, today we have with us Professor Salvatore Babones, who is Associate Professor at the University of Sydney and a commentator and an expert in international relations. Uh, Professor Salvatore, thank you so much for joining with us at the Australia today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. Salvatore, tell us, you recently wrote an article regarding the rankings of Indian democracy by certain organizations, and you have challenged those rankings based on solid evidence and facts. So, can you tell us a little more about that?
Three organizations produce rankings every year of democracies around the world. They are the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is run by a unit at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is run by the Economist magazine, and the Freedom House Freedom in the World rankings, which come from the US government-sponsored think tank Freedom House. All three have noted a serious decline in Indian democracy, especially since 2019. The first 5 years of the first BJP government, they recorded something of a deterioration in Indian democracy. Since 2019, they say there has been a serious nosedive with, the Varieties of Democracy Institute going so far as to say that India is no longer a democracy, but is now, in fact, an electoral autocracy on a par with Russia. The U.S. Freedom House says that India is no longer a free country, that it is now only this is their word, quote unquote, partially free country. Now, of course, this kind of language, I think, is wildly overblown. Indian democracy faces challenges like any other democracy does, but I wanted to get into the nitty-gritty. On what basis are they making these rankings? I mean, where are the data that underlie these judgments? And so I wrote this paper. It's a research-based paper that unpacks the rankings, goes into their detailed justifications on each item they rank, and really I found a lot of inaccuracies, politicization of actions of the previous, the previous UPA government attributed to the NDA, all sorts of inaccuracies in the rankings that, frankly, I think no one has noticed because these organizations are so credible, or at least they portray themselves as being so authoritative, that no one had thought previously to go back and look at the data.
Yeah. What made you actually look into these rankings? Because you are an independent person, completely not associated with Indian politics in any manner or form. So, what made you actually, do a little more research on these rankings?
Oh, I've never even been to India. I'm a comparative social scientist. My recent research is focused on democracy and authoritarianism, and I'm a comparativist. All of my work compares countries. So doing international comparisons, quantitative international comparisons of large numbers of countries is my own academic specialty. My academic specialty is not India, and I want to stress that. My academic specialty is rankings. I've written about the global university rankings. I've written about the World Development Indicators. I've written about the UN's Millennium Development Goals. So my specialty is not India. But when I saw the headlines coming out, especially I read in The Economist magazine that India was practically speaking no longer a democracy, that just to me clashed with the reality of what I was seeing when I follow India in the press, when I watch YouTube videos coming out of India, when I watch the news coming out of India. It just seemed so unlikely that I decided to dig into it myself. And it's been fascinating doing the digging here, because the more I dig, the more politics I find where people seem to want to use these sorts of authoritative sounding international organizations to score their own political points. So whether it's Western NGOs or people who are themselves engaged in Indian politics or Indian intellectuals who live abroad, they're using these ranking systems as a way to express their own political views through what is supposed to be a dispassionate scientific research project. Now, I mean, it's inevitable in the social sciences that we all have viewpoints, we all have attitudes that we bring to our work, but it's incumbent on social scientists to actively seek to pursue objectivity instead of just to let our own prejudices run wild. So it's no surprise that the people behind these sorts of rankings would have personal politics that are perhaps anti-Modi. But being anti-Modi is not the same thing as being anti-democracy, or at least it shouldn't be. Yet that's so much of what I find. So much what I find when I dig into this is the implication that the Indian people are somehow making the wrong choice when they choose to vote for the BJP. Now, I'm not Indian. I can't say what's the right choice for Indian people. But I think it's very clear from a detailed examination of the data underlying the rankings that India has free and fair elections. India has a vibrant free media. And people in India have cast their votes. And that's not any of my business to decide whether their vote was right or wrong.
People who do these kind of rankings have, always probably had certain bit of subjectivity. I mean, it would be very difficult for someone to be completely objective when you have strong opinions. But do you see that over the past decade that there's been, you know a lot of this happening, that in rankings and in the way India is described, that you see a shift of a lot of subjectivity coming into it, and that subjectivity being propagated as objective facts, while there are many things which have been said which are just based on opinions, and very strong opinions.
The problem isn't subjectivity as such. The problem is self-indulgence. People, instead of fighting their subjectivities, simply allowing their subjectivities to run wild. Let me give you a very practical example from the paper itself. In India, every year, there are hundreds or sometimes thousands of accusations made of sedition. Now, that's a long-term feature of Indian politics. Those are not actual charges made in courts. Those are first indication reports filed by, in many cases, ordinary people who've seen something on Twitter or seen something on television they didn't like, and they go down to their local police station and file an FIR for sedition. Now, there is the recurring accusation that the BJP government uses sedition charges to stifle political dissent, to punish its opponents, etc. Now, the report on which the sedition data are based was produced by an NGO. The NGO went back into the sedition databases, accumulated all the incidences of sedition FIRs being filed over a long period for in the 2000s, for the last 20-something years. They noted a trend. They said over the last decade, the use of sedition charges has increased dramatically. But they defined the decade specifically as 2010 to 2020. Now, that, as a data analyst, that immediately raised my suspicion. Why 2010 to 2020? That's 11 years. Usually a decade is 10 years. So either it'll be 2011 to 2020 or 2010 to 2019. Now, if you go back and look at the original data, if you do 2010 to 2019, the use of first indication report charges of sedition has declined over that period. If you use the period 2011 to 2020, it's declined over that period. But if you use the specific end dates, 2010 and 2020, you can find an increase. Now that's highly politicized research. Anyone looking at the data would say, first of all, there's no trend. I mean, this is just a long-term feature of Indian politics that, frankly, the Supreme Court's now looking at and trying to decide, should we reform the sedition system? Okay, there's no trend at all, nothing there to see. Second, in any case, these are first indication reports that are not filed by the government. So again, there's nothing there to see when literally any Indian citizen can file an FIR for sedition. So to claim that this is a government-driven action is simply disingenuous, because the people who are writing these reports are very aware of how the Indian legal system works. They're just looking for something that they can take into the international press where people are less aware, and they can then make it look bad for the government. Now, that's bad. That's opposition research. That's not actual scientific research. But it gets worse, because when Freedom House, when the Economist Intelligence Unit, when the Varieties of Democracy Institute pick up this report instead of viewing it skeptically. I mean, I'm a social scientist. Everything I view that comes from a politicized environment, I view skeptically. I mean, when I see someone on either side of politics making a statement, I question, what's their political leaning? What's behind that? Well, these three institutes producing democracy rankings simply reproduced this report as if it were objective evidence of the use of sedition charges to repress dissent in India. That's the way we see these local politics, or not local, but Indian politics, bubbling up into what should be objective international scientific appraisals. Because the people writing the appraisals don't do the simple reality check, is this really true? And I'm pretty sure, reading the reports themselves, they're not doing that reality check because, frankly, they agree with the opinions they're seeing in their sources. So instead of questioning their sources, they're just repeating them without actually questioning them closely, without asking, are they really true?
Yeah. No, Professor, this actually, beyond academics, this has real world implications because, as you've yourself mentioned, that these organizations have a certain level of credibility. How do you think this actually affects things that happen on the ground? Because if they're international observers, whether they're investors, whether they are social workers, or whether it's normal people, when they read something like this, what is the kind of impact this can have, and how do you think this is something that can be challenged?
My real concern is that Western journalists and Western parliamentarians take these reports seriously. I think within India, everyone is aware that these are highly politicized. And although the people who are anti government or anti current government, anti BJP, may rejoice in these reports, I'm not sure that people who support the BJP really are very concerned about what they say. That is, within the Indian context, I think people are wise enough, ordinary people, not just intellectuals, ordinary Indians are wise enough to understand who's who in their own politics, who stands for what, what political axes are being ground behind the scenes of these kind of reports. However, in America, in Australia, in Canada, in the European Union, we're not so sophisticated. So when you have something like, a quadrilateral security dialogue, which is based on the idea that India is a fellow democracy along with the United States, Japan, and Australia, or we have something like debates over selling defense hardware to India, with a U.S. firm or a British firm asking, can we get permission for an export license? Well, when parliamentarians see that, India is not even a democratic country anymore, according to these institutions that they respect. I mean, The Economist is one of the most widely read magazines in the world. Then there's the potential danger that it compromises international cooperation with India. It has also the potential to compromise potentially international investment in India, because again, impressions do matter. If people have the impression that India is a highly corrupt quasi-democracy with no rule of law, they may think twice about investing there. And again, I'm not talking about the professional investors. If you're opening up if you're investing in a toll road in India, your stuff, you're on the ground. But broad portfolio investment, if you're a fund manager of an Australian superannuation fund and you're considering, should I put a weighting on Indian firms into my fund? Well, you're not an India specialist. You're not doing research on specific projects. You're just generally investing on the basis of India's broad reputation for good governance. Then these reports potentially have a serious impact.
Yeah. Just one last question, Professor Salvatore, that uh, do you reckon that there is more here than meets the eye, that given the geopolitical emergence of India as a superpower and it being now a big economic power in the world as well, do you think that intentionally or unintentionally there is more here than meets the eye when we see this kind of widespread condemnation of India in newspapers and magazines and academic journals, that this is not, maybe this is not just innocent, misleading of facts?
Look, there's more there here than meets the eye, but it's not coming from geopolitics. If anything, there's extraordinary goodwill in Western countries at the official level, at the geopolitical level, at the level of governments and militaries to want to work more closely with India. The problem India has is its own intellectuals, both Indian citizens and people of Indian heritage who live abroad, who are so intent on fighting the current government in India that they're willing to disparage their own country and their own institutions in order to score political points. And frankly, I think that's very dangerous. I mean, it's the same thing we see as in the United States. I live here in Australia, but I am an American, and I see it also in U.S. politics, where people in the United States on both sides of politics disparage American institutions when what they really mean is, I don't like my opponent who happened to have won in this election. Well, the difference is that American politics are watched all around the world. I mean, everyone here in Australia has an opinion on U.S. politics. Even if they're not U.S. citizens, they still follow American news, follow American politics, and they have enough knowledge of their own to make their own judgments about American democracy, regardless of what a commentator says about the U.S. system. They don't have that expertise when it comes to India. So because Australians and Americans and Europeans are not every day watching Indian politics, all they have to go on are the opinions of Indian intellectuals. And those opinions of Indian intellectuals are what thoroughly infuse these think tank reports and what are poisoning the reputation of India abroad. It's very sad to see, but I think I have to lay the blame for this squarely at the foot, not of colonialists or imperialists or anti-Indians or people who are afraid of India's rise, but at the foot of Indians themselves. This is something that Indians and people of Indian heritage in the West really have to face up to within their own community.
Yeah. And just lastly, moving a bit away from this, as an intellectual, if we're talking about, what is India's perception, in America or Australia, beyond the academics or journalism, have you seen a shift, and how is India actually perceived in the corridors of power?
The real problem is that India is not perceived. In the quote unquote corridors of power, everybody is eager to have better relations with everyone's aware that India is going to be the next giant of the world economy. If it doesn't overtake China in the next 10 or 15 years, it certainly will by mid-century. India is the big opportunity economically, and India is also crucial for the defense of the free world. I mean, India is literally the only well-institutionalized democracy in between South Korea on one end of Asia and Israel on the other. And there's one strong democracy in the middle. That is a massive burden that India has to bear the weight of, in its essence, all of Asia, literally on its shoulders. People in the quarters of power are very aware of that. There's lots of goodwill to improve relations with India, to increase understanding of India. The problem is that beyond the corridors of power, in the general public, knowledge of India is so low and it's so out of date. Whenever I talk to ordinary Australians about India, they give me impressions from 20 years ago that have very little to do with the India of today. And it's our job really to educate them. And I say our job, I don't mean yours, I don't mean mine, I mean all of ours who have an interest in pushing forward a more accurate knowledge of India and the world. It's our responsibility to get out there and let people know what's going on in India today.
Yeah. Professor Salvatore, thank you so much for joining with us at the Australia Today.
Thanks for interviewing me.